I didn't know my grandfather well, but I knew he was a very smart person. And one thing I can take away from him after his passing is that the man continued to learn all the way onto his deathbed, continuing to read books in his last weeks of life, knowing that he had a terminal illness. To him, learning wasn't about the end result of knowing the knowledge, but actually learning was the pursuit of learning and to keep the mind going. Now, your first thought might be commendable, and I think commendable as well. I think that he was very curious and he kept his curiosity going. Learning was the journey to him. He was genuinely curious. Nobody was forcing him to read it. He wasn't even necessarily forcing himself. He had developed a curious mind that kept him going. He did it because he enjoyed it. And more you do something, better you get at it, more your brain becomes adept of taking in information, and you'll find yourself actually enjoying something that at one time may have felt like a chore. Now in his case, I think he may have been like that. He was at least like that my entire life, but I didn't know him for most of his life because I wasn't born yet. But I do know from my own personal experiences that you can teach yourself to learn better. You can teach yourself and develop a curiosity. I think you have to believe in yourself in some way. You can learn to learn. You can learn to enjoy to learn. You can learn to actually not only value gaining knowledge because you think that it's a societal thing and it's smiled upon with humankind, and because you want to know something for the end result, you want to know that program, or you want to develop a new skill. I mean, it's okay to do that too. It's the main reason I learn. But I also have found myself that I genuinely like to learn. I like to watch documentaries. I like to read things on stuff that I have no ambitions to do, just because I've developed a curiosity that keeps me wanting to learn. I don't know how else to explain it. It's interesting because at one time, I had maybe I've always been a bit curious. I've always been very curious about other people's stories on their childhoods and their relationships, especially what makes a person tick. On the more nuanced subjects, I just thought, what was the point, I guess? But now, I can't get enough of it. Now, when it comes to learning things, there's definitely a few enemies, I'd call it, or obstacles in the way. I think one of the number one enemies of learning is retention. Are you going to remember what you're trying to learn? Even if it's just an entertainment thing and it's like a new idea that you read from the internet or a magazine and you just find it interesting, are you going to remember the facts? Are you going to be able to teach somebody else that? And maybe if it's entertainment, it's not that big of a deal. However, when you're trying to learn a skill, these enemies come into factor a great deal more because you really want to remember what you've learned. And that comes down to where you're learning it, how much you're practicing it. And then it's also one of the biggest things for me is time. I always feel like I'm racing against the clock, not only to get my content out, but because I've started the process of learning a bunch of new stuff. And it's also what do I concentrate on? I'm trying to learn Blender. I think I'm pretty good at DaVinci Resolve and as far as chopping up, but I have a ways to go with color grading, and I'm getting to know Fusion pretty well. And then I also have a bunch of other interests in other programs and other skills, movement in the camera, photography, and I have a little bit of knowledge in all these areas, but it's definitely a question of where do I want to concentrate. I want to know them all. I want to be a master at all of them, but I think if I broadly try to think about all of them at the same time, then yeah, I'll probably get better at all of them. However, I might not become a master at one of them or a few of them. So it's definitely a decision to be made. And maybe, if given enough time, I could become a master at all of them. But then I also have a bunch of other stuff to learn. And life is amazing this way. It's definitely not really something to complain about other than the lack of time and speed at which you can learn. When you're younger, you can learn faster, or at least I could, than I do now as an adult, as the formed mind. Also, knowledge, like with this incredible power of the internet, we all have access to Google or whatever other search engine that's relevant. You can find the answers to a lot of stuff, but sometimes you'll spend hours and hours scrolling. When it comes to DaVinci Resolve, the program that I probably have the most confidence in me with what I've learned, is like I'm at a point now where like I know all the basics. I know even a lot of the harder stuff to do. So to try to find the answers to go even farther, because obviously like I think that there's a lot more I could learn, but the answers to that knowledge is a lot harder to find. It's like on forums now. There's not really many YouTube videos about it, and if there are, they're way in the weeds of YouTube. You got to scroll for hours to find them. And when I find a creator that's making that type of learning content, I'm very appreciative. And I think this applies to a lot of different stuff, not just me learning different programs, but also any skill that you learn. Obviously one of the best things you can find is a mentor, but they can be incredibly hard to find. And if you do find them, they can be incredibly expensive. And then if you have more than one interest and you're trying to learn a bunch of different stuff, you got to categorize your time, and then with your regular life and relationships and money, it definitely can be frustrating. However, I think the pursuit of learning has changed my life drastically, and I feel better about myself as a person. I think that I've learned to learn, and I find myself watching documentaries or reading articles about something that has nothing to do with what I'm trying to learn, and my brain is now in a mode that it used to not be, where it instantly tries to start figuring things out, and it feels really, really good. A lot of commitment and kind of being stubborn with yourself to keep on going. Now, I know that sometimes it's easier said than done to be willing to learn, excited to learn. Sometimes you just feel like being lazy. And like I said before, sometimes there's a time and a place to feel lazy and give yourself a break. But I think when we try to absorb new information, learn new skills, that's kind of, staying in line with the frequency of life itself, because there is no, you don't get to the end. You don't live happily ever after. We're born and we live and we die. Somewhere in there, hopefully you learn some lessons for one reason or another. And the only constant is change, as they say. And learning is changing. It's changing our mind. It's upgrading our mind. It's sometimes taking something we thought we knew and throwing it away or putting it on the back shelf. Learning new perspectives, learning new skills, learning how to drive at 16. I mean, that was a game changer, wasn't it? And all sorts of other stuff that I don't want to talk about on YouTube. Now, let's face it, there's all sorts of benefits to being willing to learn, or trying to learn more, trying to focus your mind on something other than yourself and learn something new. Keeping your mind sharp is one of them. Being willing to change. I mean, this is priceless, and I could make a whole nother video and rant on about it for another 10 minutes with a list of its own. Because if you have a stance on something and then you learn something new and you're willing to alter your stance on it because of that new information, I mean, that just gives you a leg up. And come on. Also, being willing to learn keeps you young, in my opinion. Sometimes when I learn something new and I get the dopamine because I know that I know it now, I'll remember that day, and it kind of slows down time. I mean, at least that's true for me. So friends, let's try to stay hungry for knowledge, be willing to change, and live the best life, and have the sharpest brain that we possibly can. And I'll either see you in the next video or I'll see you in the next live, because you just can't escape me. Ha!